Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You're very welcome to this panel where we're going to be discussing natural capital and particularly the role of valuing natural capital and accounting for it in sustainable business models. As Tony told you, I am Dorothy Maxwell. I'm the Executive Director at the TEEB for Business Coalition, and we have a panel of leaders from different communities in the natural capital space with us. So let me introduce them to you. First of all, we have Nanno Kleiterp. Nanno is the CEO at FMO Development Bank. We have Jonathan Sanchez. Jonathan is the VP of Global Communications at Unilever. We have Michelle Lapinski, who's the Senior Advisor on Valuing Nature at the Nature Conservancy. And last but absolutely not least, we have Frances Way. And Frances is the COO at the Carbon Disclosure Project. So what I'd like to do before we get into this discussion is just to briefly set a little bit of context. So let me explain to you about the TEEB for Business Coalition, and we may be able to show you a slide. I hope it will come up, but basically the coalition is a collaboration of organizations coming from the business world, the policy world, and the NGO world. And we just launched here in Singapore a year ago, and our purpose in coming together was to scale up action on natural capital, how you value it, how you account for it in business, and mainstream that in business decision-making going forward. So many of our partners in the coalition are here at the Responsible Business Forum, here on the panel, and they're going to be telling you more about their initiatives in the natural capital world throughout this forum. One of the other things I thought it was worth highlighting, the minister mentioned about longevity. And longevity is absolutely a key feature in enabling sustainable business models. But one of the challenges with longevity and why we're seeing businesses having an increasing interest in natural capital is that to maintain businesses into the long term, we need the resource base and the ecosystems that a business depends on to be maintained. And we are in this situation for many years where the natural capital resource base is being degraded, particularly with challenges like resource scarcity, erratic weather conditions from climate change. This is putting pressure on the system, and more businesses are really starting to feel that pressure on the system. So that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this topic today. And I'm particularly happy to be chairing this panel because at Responsible Business Forum, we are launching in the coalition, with support from the IFC at the World Bank, our next project in this area, which is to develop what we're calling the Natural Capital Protocol. And this is really about setting the industry norms for how, in the future, business can value and account for natural capital. And it's particularly pertinent that we launch this in the ASEAN region. We are very interested to engage with businesses where natural capital risks and opportunities are most important in the business model. And for this region, sectors like agricultural commodities, palm oil we've talked about already, but also other sectors like energy, mining, construction, consumer goods, and of course the financial services sector that underpins and invests all these sectors. We have an open invitation to businesses across the ASEAN region to join with us in this project going forward. And you're going to be hearing about it more as we go through the program today. So what I would like to do now is to ask our panelists for their views, and particularly if we start with looking at some key initiatives that are happening in their different organizations on natural capital. So Nanno, starting with you, FMO Development Bank, you're an early adopter on natural capital. Can you inspire us with the activities that you're already doing at FMO?
I will do my best. Yes, as a bank, we think that banks have a crucial role to play in getting to a better world, because banks are in a network. They have a relationship with all kind of corporates and companies in all kind of sectors. So as FMO, we have the vision that that in 2050 we have to live well with 9 billion people within the limitary boundaries of this planet. No? So that is a great challenge, because that's the only way, as we have spoken and we have heard, in the long run, that we can be successful and we can be sustainable. So we need to get to growth models where we can live within the boundary planets, and we have to include all people in, let's say, at a reasonable way of living. For us, that means that we not only look at, let's say, as FMO, we are a relatively small organization, so our direct impact on environment is relatively small. But if we look at our portfolio, our investment portfolio, of course, there is the real impact. So we said, so what to do? So we set ourselves an audacious goal to say that in 2020 we want to double our impact and halve our footprint. And then the next question is how to measure. So then we come to the issue of natural capital and social capital. Because how to measure in the different sectors. So we are focusing on the financial sector, on energy, and on agri and water. So we have been working this year on, let's say, quantifying the impact, how to quantify the impact of the different businesses we finance. And in that area, what is, let's say, in agriculture, so you make a risk analysis and see where is the biggest impact. In agriculture, I think it's a combination of land use and water, which are the key variables which impact on the planet. And let's say the inclusion part we see as smallholders which we can reach out to. In the case of energy, it's renewable energy, of course, and access to energy. And in the case of finance, it's access to finance, let's say to financial services, and at the same time stimulate financial institutions to look at sustainable, that they first of all take into account the risk, the environmental and the social risks which are implied in their portfolio, and second of all that they look at business opportunities in their countries, in their portfolios, to finance it. Because as was mentioned before, we can see the risk and we have to take into account the risk, but there are also lots of opportunities if we look forward in investment opportunities where we have to invest in more sustainable businesses. Some examples which maybe, so there for us it's very important to be part of TEEB for Business and to be part of this coalition which is looking for ways to measure natural capital. Because the only way we can do it if we can find ways to measure it together. There are lots of initiatives, and we're looking forward to get all these initiatives and all the ideas together in TEEB for Business and to see how we can come up with standards. But today, let's say everybody's doing it in his own way, but that doesn't make it very transparent, and it doesn't make it very, let's say, workable for and understandable for the outside world. Let's say there were some questions about business models in the financial sector. For us, what we do is with a client, we are, let's say, specialized in long-term finance, so we can make long-term agreements with clients. So we look to the high risks in the client's business. So that could be water usage, that could be child labor, that can be several things. And we make very concrete agreements with them how on plan step by step how to improve their business. And that over a period of 2 or 3 years. And then when they comply with, let's say, with the milestones we agreed upon, we lower our interest rates, because companies that have a better business that are inclusive and, let's say, working better with their environment are a lower credit risk for us. So that then it becomes a business case, and it is very stimulating to do that with the clients, because the client sees us at the business stage and is very keen to get to the milestones we agree on. On the other hand, we are looking for business opportunities. One I would like to mention, because it's, I think it's an interesting one, is that we have invested now in 2 private equity funds which are looking at sustainable forestry and sustainable agroforestry, making use of the REDD+ mechanisms. So there you see that those are voluntary mechanisms where CO2 gets a price, and the price is included in the business case, and that makes sustainable forestry attractive for private equity investors to invest in. So it's both sides, how to mitigate the risk, how to, let's say, see the business opportunities, but basically what we are very convinced of, what our practice is one, it has to be a business case, and second, that we have to come to transparent ways to measure the impact both on the environment and on in the social aspects.
Thank you so much, Nanno. That really illustrates so clearly the business case from a financial institution's perspective. And if we move on to a corporate's perspective, Jonathan, taking the case of Unilever, can you describe for us what you're doing on natural capital?
Sure.
You're also an early adopter.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Dorothy, and thank you for inviting Unilever to be here today. We are quite a large organization. We are the world's second biggest consumer goods company, and we sell in 180 markets, and I think 6 billion times a day someone touches one of our products. So we feel like we do have a deep-rooted responsibility to encourage both consumers, corporates, governments, and NGOs to have a very proactive role in not just natural capital accounting, but sustainable growth and sustainable business. And we see the two operating in parallel. And in reality, a lot of the work that we are doing is really trying to unlock human capital to the real intangible value of natural capital. When you have the ability to connect with so many consumers, like companies of our size do every day, we believe that if we can help motivate and create a movement with our consumers where they understand and embrace some of the challenges that face citizens of this planet as time moves on, it creates a huge groundswell. So we're very keen on a sort of a top-down and bottom-up approach. It's part of the way we've run our business for many decades, be it in Indonesia, where, of course, I know you've spoken about palm today. We were a founder member of the RSPO, in brief. We made a commitment to source our palm sustainably by 2020, and we delivered 7 years ahead of target this year to do so. And now we're looking at creating fully traceable palm through a fractionation plant that we're opening up in the outer islands of Indonesia. So we're very committed to sustainability and being more accountable for our resources. The biggest unlock for us and our business, really, and we missed a part of my title. I am communications. I'm also responsible for sustainability across Southeast Asia and Australasia. So I'm speaking to you as someone who has to deal with chairmen and make them reduce waste to landfill, and make them procure appropriately, and make them behave in a way that's responsible. The biggest challenge with natural capital accounting for companies like ours is the sheer size and scale of our supply chain and our extended relationships. So to have complete transparency over that and complete understanding, it is a complexity. So I guess we would say on a macro level, we absolutely support the creation of standards and protocols for capital accounting, natural capital accounting. But on a micro level, it's incredibly complicated. And we believe that much like the landfill legislation in the UK, which was implemented slowly and fully collaboratively and over the appropriate length of time with a gentle ramp up in costs and behaviors, this sort of approach we feel would work very well for us. The other areas we look at, of course, is as a company that has a massive sourcing of agricultural products, is making sure that we are working with governments and NGOs to create benefits for organizations when they decide to buy sustainably sourced and ethically produced products. So, we're very conscious about reducing tariffs potentially on sustainably traded products, which obviously might create some issues with WTO agreements. But if we could get international trade to get behind giving positive levies for sustainably sourced materials, it would create a huge movement. I feel like we're doing a very big journey at Unilever. In 2009, we announced something called the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which, much like yours, Nanno, is a commitment we've made publicly to double the size of our business, halve our environmental impact, but also increase our positive social impact. So whether it's the 40,000 women that work in the hyper-rural areas of northern India selling our products, which enables them to save to give their children better education, whether it's the sourcing of palm oil, whether it is creating micro-entrepreneurs in Southeast Asia. We've had these public commitments, which are annually externally audited, and for the first time last year, we published those results alongside our annual report. And it's well known, I think, in circles that our CEO is very public about a long-term view, which I know was a part of the discussion. This session is that to grow sustainably, you have to grow for the long term. A quarter's balance sheet is really only 70 days of trading, and we believe that in order to hit the goals of taking more accountability for the resources that we use, you have to take a very long-term view. So we've made these public commitments. They help us work with our customers like Walmart, who are very, very pleased to work with us on sustainability, customers like Carrefour, who we work with quite closely. So actually, we are trying to put sustainability and sustainable growth at the heart of our business. It is the heart of our business model. We believe you can only grow like we need to grow if you are being aware of your resources, managing them appropriately, valuing them effectively, and taking responsibility for their use. So you look at things like life cycle analyses. We were doing that in 2006, 2007 to create a baseline. And we take account, when you buy a tea bag from Unilever, I feel like I'm doing an advertisement now, but just as just an example. When you buy a tea bag from Unilever, many organizations in the past would take accountability for their supply chain or their factory, their impacts, not just CO2 and carbon, which is a common currency, but all of those socio-political environmental impacts. We've pledged publicly that we take responsibility from when that leaf is picked to when the consumer throws that tea bag away. And that's our target. So when you have a hot shower, Dorothy, we count the water you use in our target. So the bottom-up approach is helping consumers understand that the power of them to pull change through the system is equally as important as us sitting with WCSD and joining the right coalitions to create some positive policy change.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And now we're going to look at this issue of natural capital from the NGO perspective. And I'd like to pass on to Michelle Lapinski. And Michelle, in the Nature Conservancy, you have been working with corporates for many years on natural capital. Can you tell us some of the experiences and some more about your activities?
Sure. Thank you, Dorothy, and thank you to the TEEB for Business Coalition for having us here. If you don't know who we are, the Nature Conservancy is one of the largest conservation organizations in the world. We are headquartered outside Washington, D.C., but we operate and have offices in over 36 countries, including here in Asia, in Indonesia, in China, throughout China, Mongolia, Australia. We actually are a bit unique in the NGO world. We're not activists, but we also actually own assets. We own and manage about $1 billion in assets. So we've actually owned and operated and de-operationalized a hydropower dam. We own and operate a fishery that was on the brink of extinction and was failing financially and has now been restored and is again profitable. We actually own timberlands that we have managed and sold under multiple certifications. So we bring a little bit of putting our own assets on the table, if you will, to the work we do. And we've been working with companies. We work with companies and governments to help them understand the value of nature and how to invest in it. And companies are always looking, I actually spent the first part of my career in a corporation, so we're always looking to be more efficient. We're looking to bring more certainty to our business decision making, to reduce risk, and to realize advantage in the market. And understanding natural capital is actually essential to doing that today for companies. In the past, we weren't hearing about water scarcity. And now most of the global 1,000 companies that actually produce or do any kind of manufacturing or raw material sourcing that depends on water have had a major disruption. A factory they've had to shut down, or a supply chain they've had to divert because they've had a water shortage. And that's one of the issues that we work with companies on, is actually understanding what we call a watershed footprint. What is that bigger source of water that Singapore's minister earlier spoke about? What is the watershed, the water source? How much water does it really take, and what is the area area that it comes from. Famously, Jeff Seabright of Coca-Cola, he's the Vice President of Environment and Water, said, "Watersheds are the first step in our supply chain." That's a real shift for companies to understand nature and natural capital as a step in a supply chain. We also work with a lot of companies who are realizing that deforestation is not something they can have in their supply chain anymore. We work with Cargill on soy in Brazil, with Marfrig and Walmart on looking at the beef supply chain. Those companies have made a commitment to ensure that they do not purchase beef or soy that's coming from any supplier that has caused deforestation. Well, as we've heard in the question in the earlier session, that's actually extremely, and as Unilever just shared, that's extremely challenging to do. And it takes collaboration among technology, government, work on the ground, local business associations, local businesses to bring that together. I think one of the other key things we're seeing is a need for a shift in how we actually build our business models and how we work together. In the past, you could say, well, I'm going to go find the best product, find the best raw materials, and I'll secure those, and I'll get them on contract, and I'll produce the best product and get it to market. And now our supplies, our watersheds, are shared resources. Rarely do you find a company that owns a watershed and can go ensure they have that water supply. And so it's requiring different business models than we've ever had in the past. One of those models that the Nature Conservancy's helped create is called a water fund. And companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Procter & Gamble, Kimberly-Clark, IBM, and others, SAB Miller, have invested basically in a fund that takes companies, public utilities, other users downstream, pools those resources to invest in conservation activities upstream. Maybe it's better agricultural practices, maybe it's restoring forests that have been lost, maybe it's an easement to ensure that that land is protected for floods. But ensuring that water flows downstream to the users and that those users are paying for that water, you can track the quantity and quality of that and you can actually monetize it. You can bring a value to that natural capital that previously perhaps wasn't being paid for at all. And the last little example I'll give, and then hopefully through the Q&A we can dive into some of these, is a concept called natural infrastructure. It is essentially natural capital, but it's looking at all the things we build, say to treat our water like a wetland. Instead of treating your water with, say, a big concrete wastewater treatment plant, what if a wetland could do that for you? Well, more and more companies are actually learning that that's the case, that sometimes nature does things better than the way that we've tried to create them. And we produced a white paper this summer with the Dow Chemical Company, Shell, Swiss Re, Unilever, and McKinsey that actually gave multiple examples of where the natural infrastructure was more competitive than the traditional infrastructure. It might have been a wetland providing treatment. There are various solutions, and we actually compared the case studies on CapEx, on OpEx, on efficiency, on quality over time, and then on the co-benefits they produce. So perhaps biodiversity and species habitat, or recreational opportunities. And time again, these companies found that the natural capital, the natural infrastructure, was actually a better solution. And it led to several conclusions. One, we as businesses and as engineers need to better understand the opportunities that nature can provide. Two, we need to actually operationalize these and put these into practice so we have more examples and more people can see that business case in a variety of settings. Three, we need public policy that enables this. In some cases, meeting an air quality regulation, the only option allowed is a technological scrubber. But what if massive reforestation efforts were actually allowed? And this is actually the case in the US. We're going to hopefully see the first example of this regulation put into practice within the year. And lastly, finance was mentioned on the earlier panel, but we do need different financial mechanisms and business models.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Many of the systemic solutions that are needed you've touched on there, so thank you for that. And now I'd like to pass on to Frances Way. And Frances, in Carbon Disclosure Project, you're working with businesses and investors, but particularly from the investor perspective. How do you engage them and get them on board with natural capital?
Well, we've taken different approaches to different themes. So now we have companies, over 6,000 companies around the world, reporting on their impacts and their opportunities, really, from climate change, also water scarcity, and the drivers of deforestation. So climate change was the sort of the beginning of CDP, and we've rebranded from Carbon Disclosure Project to CDP because we've gone beyond carbon. But climate change was quite easy because there was the sort of energy efficiency element, the cost savings that companies could make, the threat of regulation, the carbon price. So investors sort of saw that as quite a natural currency, and it was easy to sort of engage investors on that so that they could have conversations with the companies they invested in. As we move to water, really building on what Michelle's just said, we're really trying to get companies to think about water stewardship, going beyond water management, because they're sharing a water basin with other, sort of communities, other businesses, etc. So they have to think about stewardship. They have to think about the long-term value impact of not having water available, both in the production of their goods and services and also in the use of their products. And whether they've got a growth strategy that they've actually thought about is water availability in the areas where this growth strategy is projected to sort of, materialize. Have you thought about that? And a lot of companies haven't. And that's one of the key questions, which we're changing our water questionnaire for next year, actually asking companies, does your, sort of profitability growth projection factor in water scarcity and water availability over the next few years? So water is really about water resilience, and investors get that because it's quite tangible, it's quite obvious, and if you haven't got water, you haven't really got a business in many, many cases. On the deforestation side, we've taken quite a different approach, well, partly because the Forest Footprint Disclosure Project started without us, and now we've merged and taken them on board. But as CDP, we've learned quite a lot from sort of being able to take a different approach to use investor language. And instead of asking companies, sort of, do you cut down trees, they're asking people really at the top of the sort of supply chain, what's your dependency on commodities that basically drive deforestation? So things like palm, soy, biofuels, all sorts of cattle-related products, and paper and pulp. And that actually can get the attention of investors much more than sort of saying, have you heard, Unilever are thinking about sort of deforestation. It's really more about, Greenpeace and everybody are on the backs of Unilever or whoever, if they're not thinking about what they do with palm oil, etc. So they're responding to that. The brand's intact. It's not going to affect the share price. So, they've got a more sustainable business in that sense. So we're now scoping out whether we should go beyond these elements to other aspects of natural capital. We're not sure really how much more there is, but we're trying to sort of work out what would be material, what would be relevant, and also very much it has to be applicable to big business for CDP because we work within the market drivers. So we're looking at the challenge for us that we're trying to address as an NGO is the fact that climate change and increasing population mean that we're going to need more energy, water, and food over time. And to meet that challenge, we sort of see business as part of that solution. And by business understanding both their impact on and their reliance on all of these issues working in the right way, and shareholders realizing that it impacts the long-term value of their portfolios and investments, we kind of feel that the right information will lead people to make the right decisions to sort of get us out of this impending sort of disaster, really. So what the other aspects might be, we're looking at companies with agricultural supply chains, whether we should be looking at soil fertility, how sort of wide we go. And then the other challenge is at the moment we have all of these data sets, but we're not actually integrating them in any way. So, that's the big challenge, and I think we might need help from some investor analysts and people to sort of sit down with us and look at the data set and work out, how does this holistically look as a sort of natural capital approach.
Thank you so much, Frances. So we've heard some amazing, innovative examples. Let's move the conversation to how do we scale this up? How do we mainstream this activity and shift the needle towards some more sustainable business models? Nanno, thinking of your sector, how do we incentivize the rest of the financial institutions to do the kind of work you're doing at FMO?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, from our point, From our point of view, it's as a development bank, of course, we are able to take higher risks. So for us, it's possible to implement it and try to and show the way how it can be done. That's one. I think what we still see in the financial sector, there are, let's say, a small number of institutions that are working on it, because I don't see much of a difference between Unilever and we have a lot of multinationals in the world who really take responsibility for their supply chain. I think what is important that they get inspired by companies like DSM, like Unilever, like the others, that also financial institutions can take that responsibility, and there are several who are doing it, but that should be the way to scale the effects of in the financial sector. Okay, so we need more actors getting behind it. I think that's the way. And thinking of Unilever, Jonathan, you mentioned the long-term approach, and this has been such an innovation of Unilever's. How do we mainstream that approach? How do we get more traction in other businesses taking that longer-term view?
Well, I think that, I mean, you have to lead by example where you can. So you mentioned soy earlier. We are now working very hard to secure a very sustainable soybean for our manufacturing, and we're by no means the largest buyer. We are one of the largest buyers of palm. So we're taking expertise where we feel we've had a deep responsibility to try and shift ways of working and try new business practices, deliver sustainability into our supply chain. And we're also now looking at perhaps some areas where you may say we don't need to play a lead role, but we're deciding to play a lead role because we want to open source the thinking. Again, I go back to what I said at the beginning. I think it's top down and bottom up. I think top down, what we want to do is be a proactive, value-adding part of more partnerships. You know, we have the scale, so we can reach billions of people every day, granted with small messages, but we can create change, and we can help use our marketing power and our ability to connect with consumers to start to change behaviors in people. So whether it is, there's a shower gel we sell in the US where we encourage people to shower for 1 minute less to save 8 litres of water, and we explain to them in television advertising what positive benefit that has. That's one level. That's about motivating consumers, because consumers drive our business. You know, and unfortunately, in a capitalist world economy, you know, the extraction of natural resources and capital is a key driver and a key cog in the wheel of this. So we have to incentivize consumers to demand more, and we're happy to do that. And at the same level, we have to leverage our scale to work with really powerful NGO partners, think tanks, groups and governments to work together. So you talk about hand hygiene in Indonesia. You know, you want to reduce diarrheal disease. Governments cannot educate children at a level that a company like ours could do. Or indeed, you talk about P&G and their work in mosquito nets, etc., in Africa. I think it is being less protectionist in terms of corporate, NGO, government, in terms of working together. And I think it is absolutely about leveraging your strengths. You know, we have the ability to connect. Just last week, we launched a campaign called Project Sunlight, the first in our history, where we're reaching out to consumers directly to engage them in sustainability. So USLP for Unilever has not been a public vehicle. It's been a way of re-engineering the business, which we feel makes it more credible than just saying we're going to be green. We've been doing this for a number of years. We launched it for the first time in Indonesia last week, India, Brazil, London, and the US. And we've had over 5 million views of a film that we made talking about creating a brighter future. I think you need to have a healthy dose of optimism. I don't think talking about sustainability and sustainable development and growth to consumers through a negative lens is as effective as it may once have been. You know, in some markets we work very closely with Greenpeace, in some markets less so. So I think a healthy dose of optimism. I think you need to take responsibility for what you're doing and to share best practice. And it's forums like this that enable us to sit with partners and say, well, you can try this. There's a place for everybody at this table.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. And Michelle, if we could come back to you, you mentioned a lot of the key pieces of the puzzle that need to fit into place. The incentive structures that are needed, regulatory and market, more supports on the business side. What do you see as the next steps on mainstreaming those sorts of solutions?
Right, I'll pick just two of those, just
Perfect.
to take a couple minutes.
Perfect.
One, I think more really spreading this through the business community And then second, I'll be touching on some of the public policy and the role that governments play, because I do think governments and regulation are actually driving a lot of this. The first, on the business side, helping more companies to see the value in this. So there's a lot of companies that are realizing this is cheaper, or this is really reducing risk and ensuring that they can secure their supply chain, or this really is creating value, creating a new business unit. I talked a bit about the role that perhaps constructed or natural wetlands can play in many times a 4-to-1 factor. The wetlands are cheaper than the constructed wastewater. And many companies have found this. In fact, Alcoa recently found this, obviously a very large company, found that this was true and decided across the board a new policy for their company would be that they would only build constructed wetlands for wastewater treatment going forward. And so they're their cost savings for their company. And it actually spurred a new business unit. So they are actually now providing this service to other companies. So I think the more that we can share those examples, to that end, one of the projects that the Nature Conservancy is involved in is an alliance with a group called the Corporate Eco Forum. This is an official project of the TEEB for Business Coalition. We're going to be launching something in January called the Natural Capital Business Hub. And that is a online platform that anyone can access. It's completely free. And there we're trying to share examples of business cases, of projects in process, of what companies are doing in this area. So we'll have about 70 cases we expect at this point. Many of them are showing that ROI, the completed business cases, the technology or the process or the supply chain innovation is already done and has been in place for many years. Others are in process, and so hopefully it'll give people a great inspiration of lots of different activities happening across different sectors and different geographies by companies all over the world. We're particularly choosing to launch this at the World Economic Forum, partly because we believe that more people need to be talking about this, putting it on their agenda, as the minister said, setting aside real capital to deal with this. And we see forums like the World Economic Forum and the annual meeting in Davos as a preeminent place where those government and business leaders are coming together. Business isn't going to do this alone, although they can realize a lot of value working individually or working together, but we're really going to have to tackle this together as business and government. And so I guess that leads me to the second part, which is what do we need regulation or public policy for? The companies like Cargill and Walmart and Marfrig are working on deforestation in their supply chains for a variety of reasons. In some cases, consumer or NGO pressure has led them to work on it. But the reality is there's a law, a forest code law in Brazil that doesn't exist elsewhere in the world. And so we're seeing companies comply with something in Brazil that they don't necessarily make a global policy. There's a wonderful example in the country of Colombia, about a year ago actually at Rio+20, announced that based on research and work they had done with a variety of NGOs, including ours, they were now have a national policy that was just instituted where you must undertake major biodiversity and ecosystem planning before any new infrastructure is put in place. Now that's great news for a country that's trying to develop more sustainably and plan its development. It's also great news for industry because if you're making an infrastructure investment, whether you're the investor or the company itself, you're probably talking a 60 or $60 billion investment, and having a little bit of security that a regulation and some guidance and some permitting up front, and that there's a level playing field amongst you and your competitors in other industries can actually be very good for those investments. If we saw more countries adopting regulations and policy like Colombia, it would be better for the investment community, better for those businesses, and better for all of us that are trying to manage our resources more sustainably. Right now, policy just like that is under consideration in Peru and in Mongolia. So I think there's things like that that would actually really move us forward and require business and government cooperating and working together.
They're great examples. Thank you so much for that, Michelle. And Francis, thinking of the work that CDP does, how do we make natural capital accounting business as usual into the future?
Sure. I think, well, in the first instance, we need to get the actual accounting standards up to speed. And I think, you know, carbon accounting is very sophisticated now, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in the other areas. So I think, you know, initiatives like this are really, really important. And by working together, we get there a lot quicker. companies often sort of say, oh, it's too early, you know, don't ask us about this, there's not a standard in place. But I don't think anyone's ever going to create a perfect accounting standard sitting on their own in a room. You know, you have to try, you have to road test it quickly. You get to a point where it works for companies and you realize things that you can't sort of anticipate until companies actually try and use it. So I think the more people involved in sort of, you know, thinking about this, road testing it, sort of giving their experiences, is really important. But it's more than accounting. First of all, the actual monitoring and measurement has got to be useful for the company themselves. It can't be a sort of compliance issue because then it's just a pointless exercise of reporting. So, I mean, at CDP with our questionnaires, we've always tried to create a framework that kind of enables management within the company. So we ask, you know, ultimately, whose job is this at the most senior level to worry about these issues? I mean, who's going to be responsible if this all goes wrong? And that's the sort of, you know, the first instance of, crikey, whose job is this? You know, sort of, is this on the board's agenda or not? Secondly, you know, what are your risks from this? What are your opportunities from it? What's your strategy to sort of see those through? You know, then there's the accounting, so you can monitor it. Then there's the target to reduce it, so you can see if you're actually progressing. But you need that context. And I think, you know, having a number on its own will not be enough. You need enough information for an investor, a shareholder, to have a conversation with a company. And it's not going to be around, oh, I hear you've got 35 tons and he's got 20. You know, it doesn't mean anything. So once companies see it's useful for them in their own management, once investors understand it, because, you know, we're asking a lot of investors these days to get their head around a number of topics that go well beyond the sort of general requirements for being a sort of, you know, fund manager or pension trustee, then it will become something that company management see as an important part of doing business, and pension funds see as an important kind of thing that they've got to monitor and encourage companies to think about. But the most important thing, I think, is there's a lot of work going on in this space at the moment. You know, there are different initiatives happening, and we just need to make sure they're aligned, they're harmonised, we're collaborating, and then it's all going to happen a lot quicker, and people aren't going to sort of go, oh, well, I'm not going to do that one because I'm doing this one, and that will just slow the whole process down. So I think, you know, we need to get everybody on the same track.
Great advice. Thank you for that. And Nanno, you would like to come in again just before we open up for Q&A, please.
Yes, just very short, because on the financial sector, I just wanted to mention what, as development bank, FMO, IFC, other development banks are doing in the financial sector. And we are supporting banks to get to, let's say, environmental and social risk management systems, that they really look into their portfolio, where are the highest risks in their portfolio, and start there really to open the dialogue with their companies, but also set a line where they wouldn't accept clients because they are really doing damaging things, or in the social aspects or in the environmental aspects. And that led to other initiatives, because then banks came back to us and said, well, why we are doing it, but our neighbor doesn't, then we have a competitive disadvantage. So we started some sector initiatives in several countries. One, I think, was very successful. We started together with a group of development banks. The IFC was there, FMO was there, other development banks were there, and getting all the banks together and say, well, let's get to a level playing field. And they agreed on a kind of, let's say, specified equator principles for Nigeria, focusing on the oil and gas sector, agri, and energy, where they said, well, we should have a similar kind of set of criteria to evaluate and assess the social and environmental impact. And what's very important in the success there was the support of the governor of the central bank. So he supported these initiatives and even took it over. And now thousands of bank employees are trained in environmental and social risk management systems, and also the supervisory board. And the central bank in Nigeria will start, starting the 1st of January, to really supervise if banks are doing and implement it in reality. And we took this example to Mongolia, to Bangladesh, where there's also a very, let's say, the president of the central bank is supporting environmental and social risk management, but also providing the banks with capital, with green credit lines in order to invest in solar energy and wind energy. We're also working in Paraguay, so you see these bigger sector initiatives that they work, and that banks are willing to get to a level playing field, and it's especially successful when central banks support this.
Okay, very valuable advice there for potential replication elsewhere. So I'd like to open the floor for questions. We have just under about 10 minutes left. So I see some over here, and I know we have roving mics and another lady here. So let's take these two questions, and then we can see who on the panel wants to respond.
Hi, my name is Joe Eads from Isfahan Group. I really wanted to sort of bring into question, you're talking about all of the accounting. We've gone into globalization, free trade agreements and opening things up, but surely shipping things 4,000 or 5,000 miles around the world isn't very sustainable, and we should be moving more to a locally sourced and locally produced type market. Really what the panel had to say about that.
Okay, global versus local, very good point. And we had a lady here also, if we can just get the mic there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anne Florini from Singapore Management University and the Brookings Institution. I'm curious about, when you're talking about scaling up, nobody's mentioned anything about the role of universities or academia. We have business schools that are still training people in accounting in very different ways from what you're talking about. Are there any initiatives that you're aware of in major business schools or accounting schools where this kind of subject is being addressed thoroughly so that our future accountants take it for granted that they should be covering these materials as well?
Great question. Okay, let's start with these two. Global versus local, and how does this stack up in terms of natural capital? Michelle, I can see you're interested, please. And then Francis, yeah.
So I think that's actually one area where the natural capital accounting can be really helpful. One of the things that we've found is you actually start doing footprinting and create environmental metrics for, say, life cycle or supply chains, or actually add the valuation, try and monetize and understand the value on those. You can actually understand how to optimize some of our supply chains. So the reality is we're probably not going to move to a world where if tomatoes and bananas are not grown where you live, you don't get them, because as consumers we've demanded them, we want them, and we are willing to pay for someone to bring them to us. But what we can do is use natural capital accounting to understand how to best optimize that and understand the trade-offs, and there's many companies individually doing that, and there's sectors that are looking at that as well. Kara from the Stably Consortium referenced the commodity mapping work that they're doing. So for instance, understanding that the cotton and where you choose to source it may have a very different water footprint. That's something that wasn't traditionally factored in to global trade agreements or to global supply chains at all. I know when I worked at Gap, the clothing company, it sure wasn't. So having that level of awareness and that data actually whether it's just quantifying that and understanding the water that it takes to produce cotton in Kazakhstan versus cotton in North Carolina versus cotton in China can be helpful, and you can actually value and monetize that and start adding that to a balance sheet or to a supply chain decision and factor that in. So I think in that sense, natural capital accounting can actually be very, very valuable. And there are some studies that actually there's kind of a blended, in some cases a regional model, that when you take into account different environmental factors, local isn't always the best way to meet all the needs that we've chosen to take on, and sometimes global isn't always the best way, but we can have better information to make those decisions.
And Francis?
Can I speak about a second question?
Please, please.
So on the role of universities, I find this really interesting, and I don't think enough is being done. But I mean, at CDP, we do try and encourage academics to use our data, and we do quite a lot of work with Harvard and Edinburgh University and Cass Business School and various different PhDs, usually, or professors sort of writing articles on it. But one of the things we try and do personally quite a lot, especially in the London office, is where we're alumni sort of help out with courses. And so I quite often will join the sort of the green aspect of the MBA at Imperial. But I have to say, it's always on a Saturday afternoon. It's obviously not that sort of highly kind of regarded, and I think there is a lot more we can do. So I'd sort of push that back almost onto universities to really think, how can they put this into the curriculum so that it's not just an add-on that we're kind of voluntarily doing in our spare time.
I would agree with that. I think that's a big gap that needs to be filled. And we had a question up here in the front, please. Here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Ong Jin Kiat from Biotech Singapore. I've noticed in this many forums and so forth, there tends to be very few bankers. So this question is more for Nanno. And in fact, because you are from Europe, and we of course know that there's a lot of banks and bankers, how do you find your role in convincing, say, local banks? I'm talking about ASEAN and even Singapore banks. How do they take part? Do you actually see them do some kind of participation apart from brick and mortar?
I didn't understand the question now.
So my understanding of your question is, how do you get more banks to participate?
More banks from the region, or even more banks from Singapore itself, because almost always, there are banks from Europe, USA, and I see, it's very quiet, in regards to local financing.
How do we get more banks in this part of the world?
Maybe
doing
they want
what
to
you're
put more
doing?
into the shares, stocks, bricks and mortars and condominiums.
Yeah.
Very good question. Very good question.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly the challenge what we see, to get in more banks with this vision. I think part of it is awareness. Awareness of, so then you're talking about the risk part, so awareness of the risk which they have in the portfolio. Because if, let's say, Singaporean banks are financing palm oil in Indonesia, and they are not looking at the environmental aspects and at deforestation, I think, I'm sure that the day will come that, let's say, the companies they finance will be held or liable, or at least will have huge problems to deliver still to companies like Unilever, so they will lose markets. So it's really a financial risk, and I think the financial institutions should become much more aware of these long-term financial risks in which where they are investing. And on the other hand, what we see is banks that have the vision that there are opportunities really are entering in new markets. Where they are making better business than other banks. So it's, I think it's similar in the financial institutions like in other sectors. When you have this vision and the long-term vision where you can make money and combine that with good business environmentally and socially, you have a long-term advantage. And by, let's say, working with the banks, showing them the risk and in their portfolios, we see that helps them to make those steps. But you need, let's say, leadership at the top to really change it.
And Jonathan, would you like to add to that?
I'd just like to support that, actually. And I think, part of the reason why we're proud to have such a large hub of our business in Singapore is that we are seeing more and more engagement by the financial services industry, by our partners in government, as you've seen today, by NGOs who are more active in this area, not just because of Palm. The discussion is not, this is not a Palm seminar, this is a discussion about natural capital accounting. And I think it's, for us, or maybe it is just a Palm discussion, but for us, it's about, it goes back to the opening point, which is it's a long-term view. We've set long-term goals. Those that don't engage now or start to have these discussions will be caught out. It will become, we believe, a point of competitive advantage. So it's not entirely altruistic. And I think to pretend that it is entirely altruistic is disingenuous. We've always said, double the business, half the impact, increase the social impact. Has two great benefits. The first is, this isn't greenwash. This is in business KPIs. In 4 years to save 300 million euros in supply chain costs. We won't say, not all of that was saved because of environmental matters. Some of it was saved because it saved money. To have zero waste to landfill saves money. To not use civic water in manufacturing saves money. So whatever your intentions are, how you express them and how you get there is your decision and your organization's values and vision. But we will get there. And I think the most telling point back to about how we teach accounting is, I think 2 years ago there was a survey which for the first time in Singapore, which is my home, my permanent home, more than 56% of graduates for the first time had said when they graduated they wanted to work for an organization which did the right thing. And that's kind of counterintuitive to some of the stereotypes of this great country. And I think it's refreshing that companies that do tie in to the long term, that do challenge partners who may not have as much motivation or the same direction, continue to challenge and stand by your guns, because it's coming.
Thank you so much for that. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, time is upon us, and we will bring this session to a close. If you could join me in thanking our speakers.